I was so inspired about my recent journey along the Forth and Clyde Canal, engineered by a chap called John Smeaton, that now I'm on an epic journey across the length and breadth of the UK to discover who this man was and why he's known as the father of civil engineering. My fascination with civil engineering first started when I walked along the Great Glen Way in Scotland, and this route mostly followed the Caledonian Canal, engineered by Thomas Telford. And it was on that adventure that had led me towards cycling another one of Scotland's great canals, the Forth and Clyde. And upon researching that trip, a new name had appeared, a man called John Smeaton, someone who I'd never particularly heard about. I wanted to find out more. Who was this man, and what else had he achieved in the run-up to the 300th anniversary of his birth? I have a curiosity for the past, and so much so that it inspired me to undertake this new adventure. And so with the help of this book, and by meeting men and women from the Smeatonian Society, together we're going to go on a journey to discover what this humble man from Yorkshire went on to achieve. To tell this story and to do it justice, my journey had to start in Plymouth, for it was here that John Smeaton was responsible for engineering a lighthouse that went on to define him as one of the greatest civil engineers of all time. Indeed, for proclaiming him as the father of civil engineering. I've come to Plymouth Hoe on England's south coast because just ahead of me is something that is probably defined as one of Smeaton's greatest ever achievements. Smeaton's Tower is undoubtedly Plymouth's greatest landmark, but it wasn't always at this location, and with an incredible history, I wanted to find out more, and Hugh Ferguson was the man to help me. The sun has come out. What a beautiful day to be sitting by Smeaton's Tower in Plymouth Hoe. And I guess really this whole project started because it wasn't that long ago that it was the 300th anniversary of the birth of the man that engineered this incredible lighthouse, John Smeaton. Hugh explained the events that led to this up-and-coming new engineer from Leeds being assigned to construct the third generation of the Eddystone Lighthouse, later to be named Smeaton's Tower.
And he was now in his early 30s when the most extraordinary thing happened, and the thing that changed his life, which was that the Eddystone Lighthouse out there burnt down, and the chairman of the shareholders who own the rights for running the lighthouse wrote to the Royal Society and said, can you recommend someone who can rebuild our lighthouse for us? He wrote back to him saying, well, yes, I can. So there's a young man here we have who is eminently suitable, and if I found my quote on it, he remarked in his recommendation that he is never having known him to undertake anything but what he completed to the satisfaction of those who employed him, which was enough for the chairman. And so at age 31, I think he was given this enormously challenging job to build the Eddystone Lighthouse. That consumed most of his activities for the next 4 years and sealed his reputation as an engineer.
We went inside Smeaton's Tower to have a look. The tower was relocated in 1882 to its present location after the Eddystone rock it was built on became geologically unsafe. This is brilliant, actually getting in the lighthouse before the visitors arrive. And what I find quite interesting is that these are literally the steps that John Smeaton would have trod when visiting his own construction. In fact, when building his own construction, because not only obviously did he design it, but he also got his hands dirty, did the work that was necessary. But this is really, really cool.
It's breathtaking, this view, isn't it? It's tremendous, and it's a bit of wind, but it's and a bit of cloud, but it's by and large, it's a lovely calm day and the sea is absolutely flat. And you can begin to wonder what was so special about this building. It's a tower, it's quite a tall tower, but it's not that big. Why was it so special? And of course, the reason is the location. And you can just out there see a small lighthouse on the end of the pier, and that's where I thought this lighthouse was. But it's not. It's just over the horizon out there, 14 miles out to sea, in just about the most inhospitable place you could possibly find. It's on the Eddystone Rocks, which had long been a hazard to the shipping traffic coming into Plymouth, which has always been a major naval port, but also far enough out to be a major hazard to shipping going up and down the English Channel as well. So it was an extremely dangerous place, and that's why they needed the lighthouse. The lighthouse must have been bigger than it is here, because part of it is still resting out on the rocks. It's only the top bit that was brought back into and rebuilt on the hoe here. So it would have been even higher above the rocks than it is now.
Hugh explained that there was 2 previous lighthouses before Smeaton was called to duty to build his version.
There were 2 previous ones. The first was blown away with everybody inside it in a terrible storm, just disappeared, no trace of it at all. The second one lasted for 50 years, I think, and then it burnt down, and that's when Smeaton was called to come and build the next one.
I asked Hugh what was the political willpower to relocate Smeaton's Tower to its current resting place at Plymouth Hoe.
I think there's probably 2 reasons for that. The first is that this was a prime naval harbour, and it depended on its trade as a harbour and its position and status as a big naval base. And anybody who was a sailor recognised the huge importance of the Eddystone Lighthouse in saving lives and making it safer to come in and out of the port. And I think they didn't forget that. But also I think that, you know, Smeaton is not remembered as well as he should be, but the one thing he is remembered for is the lighthouse here at Plymouth.
Why do you think that is?
I'm really not quite sure. Perhaps because it is so visible, it captures the imagination. It's rather nice, and I think it's therefore helped put Plymouth on the map, and I think they recognise that, and they wanted to bring it in when it had to be dismantled. And it wasn't dismantled because it had failed, it was dismantled because the rock that it was embedded on was showing some signs of erosion, and the lighthouse was said to be moving in the biggest gales, which was a pretty good sign that it wasn't going to last forever.
So the geology failed rather than the physical construction.
Exactly.
failed.
Nothing wrong with the lighthouse itself. It was the geology underneath it which was proving weak. And I believe it was the town of Plymouth who came up with the idea of not just chucking it or letting it fall down, but by taking it down stone by stone and bringing it up here to re-erect it in the hoe as a memorial to Smeaton, but also as a symbol for Plymouth, which it has become, which is tremendous.
Hugh took me for some lunch and he wanted to show me something that he'd brought with him. He explained the problems with the 2 previous lighthouses being made out of wood, whereas Smeaton had decided to build his lighthouse out of stone, using one of nature's key designs, that of an oak tree.
He decided to build it in stone, that's great. What shape should it be? Well, he took the famous analogy of the oak tree and built it to the shape of an oak tree, so it's broad at the base and then tapers its way up, becoming narrower at the top. But then the question was, well, which stone should he use? And he looked quite carefully at alternatives and came up with hard Cornish granite, which was relatively locally available. For the inside, he used the lighter Portland stone. So he designed his stonework so that it would key together and would stand with, even if there was no mortar in it, it wouldn't actually all fall apart. So you'd want to know how this worked and how it looked. So I've got a little model here.
I'm quite impressed to see this because you sent me a photo before we actually started.
Yeah, well, let's hope it works. I'm not sure I've tried it that often, but here we are. This, I'm not sure of the order in which he built it, but I would imagine he started at the middle. And this is typical section. That little shaded bit there is the hole in the middle, which is where people would walk up the tower. And if I then get all my other things together, we then have section B, which should connect into that. There's B1, B2, B3, and B4.
So this is something that obviously, you've made yourself,
Yeah.
based on exactly the principles that Smeaton
It's based on
engineered.
It's based on actually one of Smeaton's drawings, which is in his book that he produced.
As a filmmaker and someone who is trying to illustrate the life and work of Smeaton, I really appreciate the time and effort that Hugh had taken to illustrate the complex design of the lighthouse. Something, as a layperson, you just simply take for granted.
And you can see it's now beginning to build up its shape, and again, everything is stable. So if they've done that, they have to abandon the rock. They'll come back the next day or the next week or whatever and find everything is in place, nothing's been washed away because it's stuck in here.
And was this the first time that anything like this had been engineered? Was this groundbreaking at the time?
Well, no one had ever thought like this before, I don't think. No. So again, it's a part of his thorough way of thinking things out beforehand, before actually doing anything at the ground and saying, whoops, that's not working, we better do it another way. So that's that, and on we go.
Now, of course, this is only half the story, because this is all interlocking, basically almost a precursor for Lego.
Yes.
In simple terms. But then there was another part of the story of how it all sort of stayed together, wasn't it? Hugh explained that traditional lime mortar would be fine on dry land, but the mortar used on Smeaton's tower would have to withstand the waters of the English Channel.
But there was an additional problem here, that a lot of the work was underwater, and the bits that weren't underwater were subject to waves coming up and getting in the cracks. And you use a normal lime mortar for that, and it is a disaster, because it'll get washed out, first of all. If it gets saturated, it'll stop hardening, and it won't have reached its hardness. So it's only a matter of time before it then all gets washed out. He knew from reading the works of Vitruvius, the Roman engineer in the 1st century, that if you added pozzolana to a lime mortar, it worked better in damp conditions. And so that's what they used. It happened that a shipment of the right kind of pozzolana lime had arrived in Plymouth just at that time, so we bought it up and they used that, and it worked a treat.
It's absolutely fascinating, Hugh, to see the intricacy of what is in the tower behind us.
Yeah.
And for you to take time to physically make this piece of card and bring the life and the achievements of what this one man engineered, it really is sort of quite sort of awe-inspiring when you see it, when you understand what it took to build that tower. My journey then took me to my hometown of London, to the Institution of Civil Engineers. Here I met Sir John Armitt, a civil engineer by trade who left school with just a cluster of O-levels, but later went on to become the chairman of the Olympic Delivery Authority, the body which organised the building of the infrastructure for the 2012 London Olympic Games, for which he was knighted. I asked John to paint a picture to describe what life was like in the early years of John Smeaton.
I think the interesting thing about Smeaton is here we are with one of our early grammar school lads in Leeds who makes good. As with so many youngsters, Dad thinks he ought to do one thing, son thinks he perhaps ought to do something different. So Dad initially steers him off to the law, But actually Smeaton's natural curiosity already is into things, mechanical things of an engineering or a scientific bent. And so, like many youngsters who switch their courses at uni these days, he switched his back to what was his true interest, which was the world of science and engineering. And I think Smeaton, in his way, was an exceptional person. One simple parallel I would draw is that Smeaton saw what he was doing and what he was creating and inventing as something for the public good.
Right.
And as somebody who didn't have a lot of money, you might have thought, well, he would want to use patents in order to build up wealth, which was one way of creating wealth at that time. But he chose not to. And of course, if you then translate again the fact that Smeaton was the first person who sort of coined this whole idea of civil engineering, as opposed to what previously had been military. How do we use engineering in a way for civil society and for the public good? And of course, 50 years later, with the birth of the Institution of Civil Engineers, out of Smeaton Society of Engineers, Civil Engineers, you find that we have a description of civil engineering as being harnessing the resources of nature for the benefit of mankind. And at a personal level, that was the very phrase which inspired me into the whole idea of studying civil engineering. I thought, well, that sounds good. Didn't quite understand the degree to which you needed to have a knowledge of physics and maths and other things, which weren't my favourite subjects. But it was just that sort of spiritual, almost, idea of what engineering can do and how it creates things for the public good.
Although John had only left school with a cluster of O-levels, he later went on to deliver some huge civil engineering projects, including overseeing the infrastructure needed to host the London Olympics and chief executive of Network Rail.
The Institution of Civil Engineers at the time had a pamphlet, which somehow I got hold of, can't remember how, probably from the local college, which described the profession of civil engineering. And it had on the front a photograph of a guy standing essentially in a storm with black clouds up to his knees in mud, looking through a theodolite. And then on the inside it said, this is a career with the opportunity for travel, see the world, and creates the sort of the amazing structures and so on of the future. This whole phrase of harnessing the resources of nature for the benefit of mankind.
John explained how the Smeatonian Society first came about, with one of its core values of sharing knowledge.
And the Smeatonian Society essentially started in a coffee shop in Holborn with a bunch of relatively young guys in their 20s coming together and talking about their work and wanting to understand what they were each doing and the challenges they were facing and how they were addressing those different challenges and learning from one another, probably, sort of almost occasionally sitting, sipping the coffee or the pint quite quietly and sort of thinking, he's onto something there. Now I'm going to go away and see what better I can do with that idea and develop it on my own commissions that I've been given. So on the one hand, there would have been, I'm sure, quite a lot of competition going on around that coffee table, but equally there was a lot of collaboration at the same time. So the Smeatonian Society still exists today. It meets in a similar way. It's typically about 70, 75 members who get together a few times a year and talk about the challenges. Individuals will talk about their particular challenges. It then develops into a Q&A and a discussion and a debate. And so once again, people are just seeking to learn from their contemporaries in different fields and get a broader understanding of how people are tackling problems and have the opportunity to openly discuss them.
I'd really enjoyed chatting with John. I guess when you look at any city, from its buildings to its bridges, we forget that the modern wonders of today are built on the back of past engineers, men like John Smeaton. And it's that understanding that motivated me to make this film. But now it was time for an epic road trip north of the border into Scotland, where more of Smeaton's achievements were waiting. and where I'd first heard the name of Smeaton when cycling along the Forth and Clyde Canal, where he had been assigned to link the North Sea with the Firth of Forth estuary near Edinburgh to Glasgow, and later, with the help of future engineers, to link the Atlantic Ocean, which is another great adventure on my YouTube channel, so please do subscribe. I met up again with Chris O'Connell, an archivist and historian working for Scottish Canals, who I'd met previously on my Forth and Clyde cycle adventure. Well, thanks a lot again, Chris, for letting me come to your offices here in Glasgow. And it was funny because it was only, a month ago I was here anyway, when I cycled the Union and the Forth and Clyde Canals in a separate film, which is also on my channel. So it's nice to be here again. But as you know, on this particular film, I want to try to understand more about Smeaton and the role that he had in engineering the Forth and Clyde Canal, because that was probably, would you say, one of his biggest engineering challenges and feats?
Well, I would say that. I mean, geographically, it's the biggest spread of engineering. I mean, these lighthouses and all sorts of bridges and things, but they're fixed assets in a small location. I think his challenge was, and we'll explore this further as we get into it, but I think his challenge was the geography and the sheer scale of the undertaking for its time in the late 1700s was pretty epic, I would say. So, I mean, how it all come about was that there was various schemes being proposed for a canal that connected the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde, or the rivers Forth and Clyde, basically, so on the east to the west of Scotland. It was proposed to for basic commerce and trade, to get international trade in, not just local ships, but the canal was of such a depth and size that it could take the seagoing vessels of the day. Where Smeaton come into it was that there were several routes had been proposed, and Smeaton went out and surveyed these, and he proposed the route that the canal now takes, which is the shortest route across the central belt. And when it started in 1768, it had to get an Act of Parliament because of the size of the construction. If you think of all the land and the landowners that it's going to cross, you've got to have that willpower which comes from Parliament to say this is being built, and you will have to sell or rent your land to the proprietors of the canal, right, as was established. And that act, I've got a copy here if you want to have a quick look. We've got a copy here of the act. This is from 1768. It's George III, and this is him passing the Act of Parliament that allows the canal to be built. So we've got some of these original first edition copies in our archive room as such that we're in now.
And what was the alternative of the time? I imagine it was to basically go round Scotland.
Well, you would have had to travel around the north of Scotland, right up to the Orkneys and all the way around. The alternatives were the roads. Well, we say loosely roads, but the difficulty of roads is, well, one, that they've got tolls on them, generally tolls, and two, they weren't very well kept. The upkeep and maintenance of them wasn't great, and during the winter they'd be impassable.
But why do you think Smeaton was asked? What was his reputation allowing for this canal to be built? Because from what I understand, this was his first canal venture. I mean,
I think he just had a track record as an engineer. I mean, I don't think you necessarily need to be a specialist in canals to build one. Right. You need to be an engineer to build one. And if you're building a canal or a lighthouse or a bridge, it's the engineering head you've got on, is the way you're looking at that. So I think that's one of the great, for me, it's a slightly romantic look at the age, but it was a sort of can-do, will-do attitude.
I left the Forth and Clyde Canal and the city of Glasgow behind me and headed towards another great city in Scotland, Perth. And with the help of Gordon Masterton, I learned about another one of Smeaton's great achievements, Perth Bridge, or affectionately known locally as Smeaton's Bridge. As you know, I've been on this journey across the UK, And the thing that strikes me the most, Gordon, is that John Smeaton, father of civil engineering, he built lighthouses, he built harbours, he built canals, maker of scientific instruments, and he also built bridges. And what astounds me is how could one man turn his hand to so many different things?
He was remarkable from that point of view, Kevin, but in those days, the man of science, the man of engineering, which became engineering, partly due to Smeaton's terminology of being the first to call himself a civil engineer, they would turn their hand to anything that wasn't, for example, military engineering. That was the distinction. In Smeaton's definition, he was an engineer that could tackle anything that wasn't military related. And so bridges, steam engines, harbours, and Eddystone Lighthouse, famously, were all legitimately within his sphere of influence. And he could master enough of how he observed the structures that had been built before in the real world and understand the principles of how to design a safe arch bridge, for example, across a river. And he based his own designs and interpretations on what had come before.
Right.
So he built from past experience, studied it deeply, and then adapted it for his own solutions.
I tell you what astounded me when I arrived at this location, and I've never been to Perth before. This isn't a little river, is it? This is a fast-flowing, strong river. This couldn't have been an easy task.
Very much so. In times of spate, the water levels rise significantly in the Tay. And Perth City itself has had flooding events even in the recent past. There's a very large flood prevention scheme that was put in about 20 years ago, which works pretty well. So the river is susceptible to flooding, no question. And it was more so in the time of Smeaton, because now it's partly mitigated by the hydroelectric scheme further up the river. But Smeaton didn't have that benefit. So flooding was a massive issue. And the bridge, the permanency of the bridge in relation to flood events has a physical relic, because there are flood levels shown on the south abutment that show progressively just how high that water has come over the years.
Gordon showed me some historical markings that have been etched into the stone, a good illustration of just how powerful the River Tay is.
The interesting thing is that the more recent high flood levels are not as high as they were in the 19th century, because the worst of all is height of flood in 1814 up there, and that's significantly into the arch part of the bridge. So the force on the piers between the arches would have been very, very significant. But of course the bridge survived, which is a testament to Smeaton's designs. Really bad floods in living memory in 1993 are significantly lower than that. And another one down here from 2006, which flooded large areas of Perth before the flood prevention scheme was put in. So the fact that it survived all these events, which have been deemed to be significant enough to be carved into the abutment of this bridge, is a solid testament to the robustness of the design of this bridge.
What really impresses me is that the bridge is still actively used today, carrying tens of thousands of vehicles daily, with no weight restrictions, a testimony to its strength and engineering. Something that strikes me today is that obviously the bridge that we're looking at today isn't the original design per se. It has been modified to accommodate obviously, more traffic. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes. The elevation of the bridge that we see behind us is not the elevation Smeaton would ever have seen, because 100 years after it was opened, the demands of traffic had become so severe that the bridge had to be widened. An iron parapet was installed in the late 19th century. I tend to think Smeaton wouldn't have been too impressed, because he did have an eye for the aesthetics of bridge building. There are aspects on Smeaton's bridge which are subtly ornamental, so he was thinking about how it would look, and it certainly doesn't look as he would have wanted it to look now, and I don't think it's all that a sympathetic extension. We've seen better in some other bridges.
And I'm curious, what is your personal interest and fascination with Smeaton? What do you find intriguing about him?
Well, I'm a Smeatonian, so I'm a member of the Smeatonian Society of Civil Engineers, which clearly sparked an interest in finding out more about him. I'm a past president of the Institution of Civil Engineers. We regard Smeaton as the father of civil engineering. He predates the formation of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And I chair the institution's panel on historical engineering work. So I've always had an interest in where we've come from as a profession, and what our predecessors achieved and what we can learn from them.
I mean, obviously we've come to Perth and to see the bridge, but personally, Gordon, what do you think is Smeaton's greatest achievement from an engineering point of view?
Overall, that's a hard question. I mean, Eddystone made his name, but he was quite young at the time. He'd been he'd been a mathematical instrument maker. He'd worked for the Royal Society before he became a fellow himself, and he was clearly regarded as a serious individual who could turn his hand to pretty much anything that was engineering related, and that proved to be so. So Eddystone is still a major iconic achievement in the life of Smeaton.
Of course, you're an engineer yourself. What do you see the challenges that perhaps Smeaton would be getting involved in today, looking towards the future? Where does engineering need to be for the next 100, 200 years?
I think Smeaton would have been up front and centre in the challenge to overcome the impacts of climate change in whatever form they were, whether it's making our existing infrastructure more resilient to future forecasts of extreme weather events, or the root cause of decarbonising everything that we do. In many ways, he did that in the 18th century. The efficiency improvements in water wheels and in steam engines were leading to reduction in the need for fuel, for example. So the spirit of that today would be, the equivalent spirit would be directed towards addressing climate change and its many impacts.
Thank you so much, Gordon, for shedding some light into this incredible bridge. I must admit, I've spent a couple hours here filming it already, and it really is a beautiful bridge, albeit with its modern what's the word? Modifications.
Yes. Yeah.
It still is incredible to be such a dramatic river by a dramatic bridge. So I really enjoyed my time in Perth.
Excellent. I'm pleased you have. It's a fine tribute and a legacy of one of our greatest engineers, no question.
I had a really good time in Perth meeting Gordon, but it was now time to head down back south. But as I left, I was curious to understand about one of Smeaton's other bridges at Hexham on the River Tyne, as this particular bridge didn't quite end up as Smeaton planned, if that wasn't an understatement. Whilst in Perth, Gordon had spoken about Smeaton's ill-fated Hexham Bridge and the impact this must have had upon him.
Ironically, having achieved so much with initially Coldstream Bridge in Scotland and then Perth Bridge soon after in the 1770s, the final bridge, major bridge that he designed, Hexham Bridge, sadly was washed away because of scouring of the foundations 2 years after it was constructed.
Scouring is when the foundations around the bridge are eroded by water.
Which was devastating to Smeaton. He would be in his 50s by then, towards the end of a glorious career. He'd had 30 years of success in everything that he turned his hand to. And he took the collapse of Hexham Bridge very, very seriously. And he was devastated by what had happened there. And the root cause of it was an underestimate of the quality of the foundations below the piers, and the force and the speed of the water in spate scouring out that material underneath quite a significant number of the piers. Three or four of the piers were washed away in a single event.
Would it be fair to say, and I don't want to be over dramatic here, but would it be fair to say that that almost broke him, its collapse?
I think it is fair to say that. In his own words, he described it as the melancholy incident of the collapse of the bridge at Hexham, and it took him a long time to get over it. He was asked to express an interest in the redesign of a new bridge across, and he refused because he said, no, appoint someone who's an able engineer who can take this on and doesn't have the memory of the horrors of the River Tyne still painted on his imagination.
Despite Smeaton no longer being involved, the rebuilt bridge still shows clear pointers to its original design. After Hexham, there was an emotive place that I had to visit, the small town or village as it was known back in the Smeaton era, Whitkirk, the place where Smeaton is laid to rest. This is Whitkirk Church, and I must confess, as a non-religious person, this place does, however, have a sense of true wonder. There is something really special and unique about this church. You feel it the moment you walk into the door. Its history oozes from its walls. There's been a place of worship here for over 1,000 years, or nearly 1,000 years. And yet for me, as a filmmaker, the very man that I've been following across this epic journey from the length and breadth of the UK is buried here under the altar. And I know it might sound a bit sort of strange, but it's actually quite moving. I've been doing so much research and understanding and trying to work out who this man was. To come to the place that he's actually resting is actually quite moving. And we owe so much to this man, we owe so much to John Smeaton, and yet somehow, for those that are not tuned into the world of engineering, his name has been lost in the pages of history. And I just hope by me doing this little film, I can pay him that little bit of justice. Now, of course, most people have a hobby, and Smeaton was naturally no exception, except his hobby is the equivalent of other people's full-time career. Although, of course, Smeaton is recognised as an engineer, what he achieved in the science of astronomy is, excuse the pun, literally astronomical. Whilst in Whitkirk, I met up with David Sellers, a retired engineer with a passion for the history of astronomy, who has written several books on the subject matter, including one about Smeaton's contribution in the field.
Well, it's certainly something that he spent most of his life doing. It was the passion, the ruling passion of his life outside his professional activities. And certainly he did treat astronomy seriously. He was not a dabbler. Everything he did in astronomy was at a very sophisticated level. He had, for example, not far from here in Austhorpe, where he lived, his own observatory. He made telescopes and micrometers for himself and others. He wrote, in the course of his life, 6 important papers for the Royal Society to go in their philosophical transactions. So certainly he was a serious astronomer as well as being an accomplished civil engineer.
So through his understandings as an engineer, that probably supported his work in astronomy, and then vice versa. So one in some way would complement the other, and he would learn certain aspects of perhaps mathematics or trigonometry or calculus that would actually help him in both fields. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Well, certainly his experience as an engineer will have been useful to him in the advice he gave, for example, to Mitchell, who was constructing a very large telescope. He also became well known for designing permanent observatories for some of the most noted astronomers of his time. And actually, the observatories that he designed were of a pioneering kind. They had rotating roofs with a slot in them that opened to allow the telescope inside the observatory to look at any part of the sky. And now we think of that automatically as being the typical observatory design. But before Smeaton's time, virtually all the observatories in England were of a kind that only allowed the telescope to point north or south. Smeaton designed the rotating roof, which allowed the telescope to point at any part of the sky.
I've heard this expedition, the transit expedition of Venus to Tahiti, is a bit of a mouthful. I'm probably saying it completely wrong there, David.
Yes.
But could you tell me a little bit about it? Because I've only got a glimmer of knowledge.
Well, occasionally the planet Venus passes in front of the sun and can be seen as a small silhouetted black disk against the face of the sun. This event occurs in pairs separated by 8 years, but between each pair, more than 100 years must pass before it occurs again. Astronomers around the world were positioning themselves at different locations, far-flung locations, in order to time the movement of Venus across the sun and thereby triangulate the distance of the sun to work out how far away the sun was.
Jeez.
And for that, to help them in doing that, Smeaton designed a mobile observatory. And it was one of his mobile observatories that was taken on the Endeavour expedition of Captain Cook to Tahiti to make observations. And at the end of that observing campaign, which was probably the first international scientific campaign, the astronomers were able to deduce that the distance of the sun was approximately 150 million kilometres, although they measured it in miles, 93 million miles, which is very close to the value that we now understand it to be. So Smeaton played a small part in helping to size the solar system in that way.
It's incredible. Like I keep on coming back to this point, you know, that he was involved in so many other grand civil engineering projects, and yet this was almost like a hobby, something he did in his spare time, but to a level that by any man's standard is a profession.
Indeed, and that's one of the interesting things about the history of astronomy and the history of science and engineering. It opens our eyes to just how people have made steps forward that could not have been imagined in their own time. And what we need to do is encourage an interest in the young people, children at school today, an interest in nature and the world around them. And who knows which of them will be the next Smeaton to come along, the next person to actually explore in greater depth the world around them than their ancestors or parents did.
It's just a question of having curiosity, isn't it?
Exactly.
And I think that probably is a good point to conclude, is that I guess Smeaton inherently was just a curious man.
Indeed.
Nearby Whitkirk is Temple Newsome. Built in the 16th century, it's also the location where Smeaton built a water pump, which also helped supply some of the ornate fountains in the gardens. This infrastructure has pretty much disappeared, but I used the location to meet Helen Wild, a civil engineer by trade and winner of the Smeatonian Society's highest accolade, the Smeaton Medal.
I know, I'm on this grand tour of the UK, really from Plymouth to Perth and Leeds, here we are in the middle, and London also, on this kind of journey to kind of understand who this chap John Smeaton was. And what I find quite sort of interesting is everyone I'm meeting is a Smeatonian, part of the Smeaton Society. And yet here I am with you.
Yeah.
Thankfully, you're none of those.
No, I'm not.
And a bit like me, you're like, okay, originally, who is this guy Smeaton? But can you tell me, like, how did you get involved with the Smeatonian Society?
So it was probably around about this time last year, maybe a few months earlier. My line manager, my boss at the time, had sort of suggested that he wanted to nominate me for the medal, the Smeatonian Medal. This particular series of medals was for people in their early to mid-career, for work on, I think was termed challenging and hostile environments.
Right.
Now I work in the nuclear decommissioning industry. I'm a civil engineer for Sellafield Limited, so the projects that I'm working on do fit that definition. But anyway, the application went in, and then it kind of just went to the back of my mind, and then one day I was sitting in the office, and my boss came to see me and was like, "Have you read your emails yet?" And I was sort of looking at him thinking, "No, why?" I was invited to their AGM.
Sorry, was that in the Smeaton room at the ICE?
At the ICE, yeah. So,
right.
So that was quite a formal dinner. It was quite daunting actually, because their tradition is that the medal winner presents a discussion topic. It was the people who were there that made it quite daunting. You know, we're talking past presidents of engineering societies. We're talking people who've been, you know, in charge of some of the most iconic projects in recent times. You know, names that you would never have. I would never have contemplated a scenario where I would be in the same room as these people.
Mm.
And not to mention, Her Royal Highness Princess Anne was there.
A royal?
Mm-hmm. And I actually sat next to her.
Really?
Yeah. And so it was a very nerve-wracking evening. I don't think I properly relaxed at any point.
I asked Helen, did receiving the award make a difference to her?
Like, well done. That's.
I suppose for those that know, it matters.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure it's on your CV.
Oh, absolutely. That got updated.
You put it on your LinkedIn.
Absolutely did. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've actually brought it with you, haven't you?
Yeah. Do you want to see it?
Come on then. I mean,
it'll look glorious in the sunshine. So yeah,
and
it has his lighthouse on the front, the 3rd Eddystone Lighthouse. I'll take it out actually.
Wow. Let's just have another little look. Let's just. And who physically presented that to you? Was it the Princess Royal?
It was, yeah.
I asked Helen what inspired her to follow a career path in civil engineering.
I think my career path's a little bit different to other people's. I think there's a lot of people who do civil engineering, particularly women who do civil engineering, who kind of always really knew that was what they wanted to do. That very much wasn't me at all. I, for most of my kind of school years, wanted to do medicine, and that was what I thought I was that was the path that I thought I was going on. And it was actually a really kind of chance conversation with one of my teachers at college, my maths teacher, standing in the queue in the cafeteria for dinner, and he just sort of said, "So what are you going to do? What's your plan?" And I was sort of saying, "I don't really know. I thought I wanted to do medicine, and I'm not sure anymore." And it was him who said, "Have you thought about engineering?"
Or is there?
I asked Helen, did she think there was a lack of women in civil engineering even today?
It still very much is. I think if you look at the statistics, it still is. It's getting better. There are more women in the industry now than there were before, but the statistics still aren't great. And I think civil engineering in particular is not quite keeping up with other professional kind of jobs that were historically male dominated and are having that kind of starting to see that redistribution. So
I had to ask Helen what advice she would give to any young girl that also wanted to pursue a career in civil engineering.
I think if I kind of think back to who I was when I was 15, I think you feel like obviously every decision that you're making about, you know, what GCSEs you take, what A-levels you take, what university you're going to go to, feels like such a massive decision, and it feels like it's gonna, you know, it feels like the most important thing in the world at that time, because it is to you at that time. I think the only thing that I would say is that whatever decisions that you do make, there's never a point, I don't think, at which it's too late to change your mind about what you want to do.
Back in London, I met with Emma Pinchbeck, CEO of the Climate Change Committee, a UK government body responsible for the transition between a carbon past and a renewables energy future.
Emma, I was thinking, if John Smeaton was alive and kicking today, what kind of things do you think he would be putting his focus towards?
Oddly, I think he'd have been putting his focus on the same things that we know that he was interested in previously. So, you know, people think about Stephenson or Watt as the founders of the kind of energy system and the industrialists most associated with energy. But Smeaton was interested in wind turbines really early. He was interested in material sciences, and the future of energy systems are going to be dominated by wind turbines and things like solar PV and batteries. So I reckon he'd have been doing the same stuff, just with the technologies of today, and helping us solve problems which include how do you make wind turbines more efficient, it's about aerodynamics, how do we recycle materials, how do we link all of these things up effectively. You can completely see an intellect like Smeaton's just doing the same stuff, but in the energy system of the future. So, you know, forget Watt or Newton or any of the old industrialists. Smeaton is the founder of the modern energy system.
It's quite incredible that a man that was born 300 years ago, in a way had a green vision before green engineering and green concerns were a buzzword, were an issue.
Yeah, it's if we've gone back several hundred years and looked at the steam engine and looked at electricity and looked at the previous industrial revolution, and instead plucked out this idea that you can use wind turbine engineering to generate electricity and build systems around that, and things like solar, and not undo the legacy of the last industrial revolution, because it did some incredible things for society, but certainly start and build a new one. And, you know, all of this was built on the previous industrial revolution, and my children will inherit whatever we build with the one that's to come.
And I guess really a lot of that forward thinking is down to engineers.
Completely. Yeah, this is an engineering problem. People rightly think about tackling climate change as an environmentalist problem or a behaviour change problem, or about, you know, the way that we live as individual humans. But I would argue a significant, in fact the majority of the problem is an engineering problem. It's about how do you move from generating energy from fossil fuels to generating it from renewables. How do you move that clean electricity through your power system? How do we use it differently in our homes, in our cars, you know, in our aircraft? It's a technological and engineering challenge as much as it is a kind of human behaviour one. And so when you think about, you know, green, you should think about industry.
My final call in London on this 2-week-long trip was the Royal Society, founded in 1660 to further the progress in science, with its Latin motto, "Take nobody's word for it." It welcomed Smeaton into its fellowship, primarily as a designer of scientific instruments.
So the Royal Society is the sort of UK's Academy of Sciences, and it is made up of fellows or members who are sort of preeminent scientists in their field. It covers all branches of science and engineering as well. So Smeaton was elected as a fellow in 1753 in recognition of his skills as an engineer and an instrument maker.
Okay, because I'm a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society because I've got a passion in geography and natural history and ecology, but then I don't have any scientific or engineering background. But then would I be able to be involved in the Royal Society in any way?
Not as a fellow, because requirement for entry to the fellowship is it's judged on scientific excellence, and that usually means having published scientific research papers or making some contribution to industry.
Right.
And you would have to be nominated by existing fellows.
Virginia Mills, an archivist working for the Royal Society, explained that Smeaton was highly recognised and went on to win its highest accolade, the Copley Medal.
Certainly very celebrated in his own lifetime.
Yeah.
He won the Royal Society's most prestigious scientific award, the Copley Medal, which has been going longer than the Nobel Prizes.
Wow.
And, you know, counts many Nobel Prize winners amongst its number. And yes, Smeaton was given that award in 1759 for his work on water wheels and windmills. So yeah, he was certainly, people recognised the importance of what he'd done in his own lifetime.
It's quite funny actually seeing the original portrait, because of course in all of my research this has been the definitive likeness that I've come to recognise as John Smeaton, and to see it, the original, hanging up in the Royal Society is actually quite exciting. I know it's only a painting, but it's something that I've been focusing on for the last couple of months, trying to understand who this man actually was.
This had been a very unique journey for me, a journey that was born out of taking an adventure along one of Scotland's long-distance trails, the Great Glen Way. I've learnt that if you look closely at the world around you, then that curiosity can take you into any direction. Telling the story of John Smeaton was never on my agenda, but I've learnt that this man from Leeds, in the 300th anniversary of his birth, who led the way forward in so many ways at a turning point into what we could define as the modern era, was more than just a lighthouse builder. His depth and knowledge, and indeed foresight, truly defined him as a father of civil engineering.